When I first bought the house, I thought I had finally struck gold because after years of saving, searching, and planning, I found the perfect little slice of peace, a cozy, spacious home on a quiet street with enough backyard for a grill, a garden, and maybe even a future pool if I ever decided to splurge. And the best part, it wasn't part of any HOA, which for anyone who has ever dealt with those homeowner associations knows, it's like dodging a bullet because I've heard horror stories about people getting fined for the color of their blinds, the length of their grass, or even for having a certain type of car in the driveway, and that was exactly the kind of nightmare I wanted to avoid. So, when the realtor happily confirmed that this house was outside of the HOA boundary line, I practically shouted sold before the papers were even printed, and I drove up to my new home on move-in day with a grin stretched ear to ear, my wife in the passenger seat, the moving truck behind us, and a fresh wave of excitement pumping through my veins. But little did I know, I was about to meet the reason why people warn you about nosy neighbors, because across the street stood Karen, the unofficial queen of the HOA, with her hands on her hips, a scowl etched so deeply into her face it looked permanent, and as soon as she saw us pulling into the driveway, she stormed over like we had just parked on her lawn, demanding to know what we thought we were doing because apparently, in her mind, nobody could move into the neighborhood without her approval. And when I calmly explained that this was my property bought and paid for, she sniffed like she didn't believe me, pointing out that this entire block was under HOA jurisdiction and that we had to submit a move-in notice to the board. But when I told her flat out that she was wrong, that my house was just outside the HOA boundary and that I had specifically bought it for that reason, she lost her composure right there on the sidewalk, ranting about how my home ruined the uniform aesthetic and how I would be expected to follow the rules like everyone else. And my wife squeezed my hand, whispering to just let it go, because she could tell I was about to snap. But I wasn't about to let some stranger dictate how I lived in a home I had just signed my life savings away for, so instead, I told Karen that she had absolutely no authority over me, that she was welcome to take her complaints to the HOA board if she wanted to waste her time, and then I turned my back on her and started unloading boxes from the truck, thinking that would be the end of it. But as anyone who has ever lived near a Karen knows, that was only the beginning of a long, ridiculous battle that I hadn't signed up for, because from that day forward, it seemed like she made it her personal mission to drive us out of the neighborhood, starting with her daily harassment about our non-compliant mailbox, our improper fence, and even the shade of gray we had chosen for the shutters, which she claimed clashed with the HOA's approved palette, even though once again we weren't in the HOA, and every time she showed up with her clipboard and her holier-than-thou attitude, I reminded her of that fact. But it only seemed to make her angrier until finally, on the third day of us living there, she crossed the line by knocking on my door at 7 a.m. and demanding I leave immediately because this home was not authorized by the association, and that was the moment I realized this wasn't just a nosy neighbor issue, it was going to be an all-out war. The morning Karen banged on my door at 7 a.m., demanding that I vacate the premises immediately as though she were some kind of sheriff executing an eviction order, I realized she had officially lost her mind because the audacity it takes for someone to think they can kick you out of a house you legally own is insane. But when I calmly reminded her that this was my home, paid in full outside of HOA jurisdiction, and that she had no authority whatsoever over me, she puffed up like a balloon, ready to burst, insisting that she was on the board and that all decisions go through her, which was hilarious because, first of all, she had zero jurisdiction, and second, even if I were in the HOA, she wasn't the president, the treasurer, or even an official representative, just a volunteer committee member who clearly took her imaginary power way too seriously. But she wasn't listening. She just kept shouting that I was bringing down property values with my rogue house, as though a perfectly maintained home with new shutters and a neat lawn was some kind of blight on the neighborhood, and my wife, still half asleep, peeked around the corner to see what the noise was, only to roll her eyes and mutter, "Here we go again," before disappearing back into the kitchen to make coffee, because she knew I wasn't going to back down, so I stepped out onto the porch, looked Karen dead in the eye, and told her flat out, "This is my property. You don't own it, the HOA doesn't own it, and you don't get to tell me what to do." And the look on her face was priceless, like nobody had ever dared to defy her before. But instead of leaving, She hissed like some kind of angry cat and declared, "You'll regret this," which might sound like an overdramatic movie line, but she actually said it, and then she stormed off across the street with her phone in hand, already dialing someone, probably the HOA president, the cops, or maybe her fellow Karen squad. And sure enough, within an hour, as I was unpacking boxes in the garage, a white SUV with a big HOA sticker on the side rolled up, and outstepped two men in polo shirts and clipboards, clearly the enforcers, and they strutted up my driveway like they were about to serve me with papers, only to freeze when I cut them off with, "Let me stop you right there. I'm not in your HOA. This property is outside the jurisdiction. Check your maps before you waste my time." And the way their confident smiles faltered told me everything. They knew I was right, but Karen had clearly dragged them into this mess anyway, and they hemmed and hawed for a few minutes before finally admitting that technically, yes, my property line was outside the HOA boundary. But then they had the nerve to suggest that I voluntarily comply with the HOA rules for the sake of neighborhood harmony, which almost made me laugh out loud, because the whole reason I bought this house was to avoid exactly that nonsense. So I told them, politely but firmly, no thanks, and closed the door in their faces, leaving Karen fuming from across the street as she watched the whole thing from her porch like a hawk watching prey slip out of its claws. But of course, she didn't stop there, because that night, around 9 p.m., as my wife and I were settling in with takeout on the couch, we heard loud knocking again, and when I opened the door, there were two police officers standing on the porch, with Karen lurking smugly behind them, arms folded like she had just summoned reinforcements to finally take me down, and I'll admit my stomach dropped for a second because nobody likes seeing cops at their door. But as soon as they explained that they had been called about a trespasser occupying an HOA property without authorization, I knew exactly what had happened, so I showed them my deed, my ID, and even the property line paperwork from the realtor that clearly marked my house outside of HOA boundaries, and within minutes, the officers turned to Karen and basically told her to knock it off, that this wasn't an HOA issue, and that I had every right to be there. But instead of backing down, she screeched at the cops about how they were failing to uphold community standards and that they were letting criminals ruin the neighborhood, which was insane because literally nothing about what I was doing was criminal, and the officers gave her the same look I had been giving her since day one, that look of pure disbelief that one person could be so entitled. And finally, after another 10 minutes of back and forth, they told her if she kept harassing me, she could be cited, not me, and they left. But as I closed the door and leaned against it, exhausted from the drama, I realized something important. Karen wasn't going to stop, not with warnings, not with logic, not even with the police shutting her down, because this wasn't about rules or property values. This was about control, and she couldn't stand the fact that she had no power over me. So I decided then and there that if she wanted a war, I was ready for one, because I wasn't about to let some self-appointed dictator bully me out of my own home. And as I looked out the window at her pacing angrily on her porch under the dim streetlight, I knew the battle had only just begun. If I thought Karen's tantrum with the cops was the peak of her craziness, I was dead wrong, because what came next was her turning the entire HOA into her personal army, and it started innocently enough when I opened my mailbox a few days later to find an envelope stamped with the HOA logo, even though I wasn't a member, and inside was a notice of violation listing fines for failure to submit architectural review forms, non-compliant mailbox design, and unapproved landscaping, which made me laugh so hard I nearly dropped the paper, because it was essentially a bill for hundreds of dollars of fake charges that had no legal basis. And when I showed it to my wife, she just shook her head and said she's really going to waste stamps on this. But the thing is, Karen didn't just stop at one letter. No, she sent a new one almost every other day, each one escalating in tone, from courtesy notice to final warning to intent to place a lien on property, and I could tell she thought she was scaring us, but the only thing it did was make me angrier. So I started saving every single letter in a binder, knowing I might need evidence someday, and sure enough, a week later, Karen showed up with two other HOA board members in tow, marching up my driveway like stormtroopers, waving clipboards and demanding entry to my backyard so they could inspect for compliance violations. And when I blocked the gate and told them they were trespassing, Karen shrieked that all Properties in this neighborhood are subject to inspection, to which I calmly replied, not mine, and shut the gate in their faces, and the way her jaw dropped was pure gold. But of course, instead of realizing she was beaten, she doubled down, and suddenly flyers started appearing on the doors of every house on my street with bold letters reading, "Warning, non-compliant resident," with my address listed underneath like I was some kind of criminal, and the flyer accused me of lowering property values, refusing to cooperate with the HOA, and threatening community safety, which was hilarious because I hadn't done anything except live in my own home. But still, the smear campaign was working because a few neighbors started giving me side eye, whispering as I walked past, though thankfully others saw right through her nonsense and quietly told me they were tired of Karen's antics too, because apparently she'd been bullying people for years, fining them for leaving there trash cans out for 10 minutes too long or for having a garden gnome that wasn't pre approved, and some even admitted they stayed in the HOA only because they didn't want to fight with her. But when I told them I wasn't actually under her jurisdiction, a few jaws dropped because they didn't even know non HOA houses existed on the street, and word spread fast, which made Karen even more furious because now her little empire was cracking, so she decided to escalate to sabotage one morning. I woke up to find my trash cans knocked over and garbage strewn all across the lawn, the lids nowhere in sight. And when I checked my security cameras, guess who was there at 2 a.m. in her robe and slippers, shoving over the bins like some deranged raccoon? Yep, Karen caught in full HD. And when I showed the footage to a few of the neighbors who had been skeptical, their reactions were priceless, because seeing Queen Karen herself breaking the very community standards she screamed about daily exposed to hypocrisy, but instead of apologizing, she went nuclear, calling in another bogus complaint to the police, this time claiming I was running an illegal business out of my home because she'd seen delivery trucks dropping off furniture, which, of course, was just me finishing my move in. But when the cops came out and once again confirmed I was doing nothing wrong, I swear I saw steam coming out of her ears, and it hit me. Karen wasn't going to quit because this wasn't about rules, this was personal now, and she wanted to break me, to drive me out, to make me bend the knee to her imaginary throne. But what she didn't realize was that she'd picked the wrong neighbor to mess with because I wasn't going anywhere, and in fact, her harassment was only giving me more ammunition, literally recorded evidence and paperwork of her harassment campaign. So I started documenting everything, every flyer, every letter, every complaint, every little stunt, and my binder was filling fast. And one evening, as I was sitting at my kitchen table flipping through the stack of HOA nonsense, my wife leaned over and said, you could probably sue her for harassment. And that's when the light bulb clicked, because while Karen thought she was waging a neighborhood war, I was quietly building a legal case that could dismantle her entire little fiefdom, and as I looked across the street at her porch where she sat sipping wine like a victorious general, I couldn't help but smile, because she had no idea that her war was about to backfire spectacularly. By the time my binder was stuffed full of bogus violation letters, copies of slanderous flyers, screenshots of her angry texts, and most importantly, the video footage of her trespassing on my property and vandalizing my trash cans, I knew it was time to flip the script because while Karen had been running around acting like she was the sheriff of the street, I had quietly built an airtight case against her. So I scheduled a consultation with a lawyer, and let me tell you, the man nearly choked on his coffee when I dumped the binder on his desk because he couldn't believe the sheer audacity and obsession documented in those pages. And after reviewing everything, he told me not only did I have grounds for a harassment and defamation suit, but I also had enough evidence to file a restraining order, which made me grin ear to ear because suddenly the war Karen thought she was winning had just shifted completely in my favor. So with my lawyer's help, I filed the paperwork, and within a week, Karen was served with a cease and desist order that required her to stop all contact with me, stop distributing flyers, and stop filing false police reports. And the look on her face when the sheriff's deputy handed her the envelope was pure cinematic gold. Her eyes bulged, her mouth dropped open, and she shouted something about community rights before slamming her door in his face, but it was too late because the law was now involved, and when she violated the order just 3 days later by slipping yet another final warning HOA letter under my doormat, I didn't even confront her. I just handed the evidence to my lawyer, and suddenly, Karen found herself in real legal hot water with court dates and fines piling up faster than the fake ones she used to send me. And the fallout didn't stop there because word of the lawsuit spread through the neighborhood like wildfire, and neighbors who had once been too scared to speak up against her were suddenly emboldened, approaching me with their own horror stories of Karen's reign of terror. People fined for hanging wind chimes, kids banned from drawing chalk on the sidewalk, families threatened with liens over flower pots. And as more and more of them realized she was vulnerable now, they started organizing, showing up to HOA meetings in droves, demanding accountability, and within a month, the once feared Karen found herself voted out of her board position by a landslide, her little empire crumbling around her, and the cherry on top? The HOA president himself came by one afternoon to personally apologize for the harassment, admitting that Karen had grossly overstepped her authority and dragged the entire association into unnecessary drama. And while he couldn't stand her either, nobody had ever had the guts or the evidence to stand up to her until now. So not only was she legally muzzled by the court, but she was also stripped of the power she had clung to for years. And as she sulked on her porch watching her influence vanish, I couldn't help but feel a deep, satisfying sense of victory, because this wasn't just about me anymore. It was about everyone she'd bullied into silence, and now they were free too. But the final blow came a few weeks later when I got a call from my lawyer telling me Karen had quietly agreed to settle the case out of court, likely because she realized if it went to trial, all the embarrassing footage and documents would become public record. And the last thing Queen Karen wanted was her entire neighborhood knowing she had been caught on camera knocking over trash cans at 2 in the morning like a deranged teenager, so she ended up cutting me a check large enough to cover my legal fees, a brand new backyard grill, and then some. And the irony wasn't lost on me that the same woman who once sent me fake fines was now paying me real money for harassment. And from that day forward, Karen was a ghost. She still lived across the street, but she never spoke to me, never looked at me, and never set foot anywhere near my property again. And honestly, that was fine by me because I'd gotten everything I wanted: peace, freedom from HOA nonsense, and the satisfaction of knowing I had stood my ground and won. And now, every time I sit on my porch, beer in hand, watching my wife tend the garden or hearing the neighbors laugh as their kids play outside without fear of Karen's clipboard, I smile because I remember the moment she told me I'd regret not bowing to her authority, and it turns out she was right, but only because she ended up regretting it herself every single day as she sits trapped in the prison of her own bitterness while the rest of us finally get to enjoy the neighborhood without her tyranny. And that, my friends, is how the HOA Karen across the street lost it all when she messed with the wrong homeowner.